The fines did not arrive all at once. They crept in slowly, quietly, disguised as routine notices and procedural reminders, the kind that were easy to dismiss when life was busy and the envelope looked like every other piece of mail from the Homeowners Association. First, it was a warning about a trash can left out too long. Then, a citation for a section of fence that supposedly did not match community standards. After that came the landscaping complaints, vague and repetitive, always referencing rules that seemed flexible when applied to some homes and unforgiving when applied to mine. At the time, the HOA board had recently changed. Longtime members who understood the neighborhood had been replaced by a new group that took enforcement personally. The tone of the letters shifted. Where there had once been explanations, there were now demands. Where there had been courtesy, there was now authority. Each notice included a deadline, a fine amount, and a reference to bylaws that were never attached. The amounts were small at first. $25.
$50.
Annoying but not alarming. I assumed, like many homeowners do, that resolving the issues would eventually stop the bleeding. I corrected what I could, disputed what I didn't agree with, and ignored the rest when the board failed to respond. What I didn't realize was that the HOA was quietly stacking penalties, compounding them monthly, and recording every missed payment as a mark against my property. By the end of the first year, the fines had crossed into the hundreds. By the end of the second year, they were well into the thousands. Every letter looked more aggressive than the last. Bold text replaced polite language. Legal terms began to appear, scattered throughout the pages like landmines. Late fees were added to original fines, and administrative charges were layered on top of everything else. Still, no one ever explained exactly how the numbers were calculated. The real shock came when a certified letter arrived stating that my outstanding balance had reached just over $5,000. The notice warned of possible liens, collection actions, and legal remedies available to the association. It was no longer a nuisance. It was a threat. The timing couldn't have been worse. Personal expenses were high, work was demanding, and the idea of fighting an HOA felt exhausting. Like many homeowners, I briefly considered paying just to make it go away. That was the pressure the board relied on. They knew that most people would fold rather than challenge an organization that presented itself as untouchable. But something about the letter didn't sit right. The numbers felt inflated, almost careless, as if no one expected them to be questioned. The references to bylaws were vague, citing sections without quoting them. The deadlines were strict, but the explanations were absent. It was authority without transparency, and that was the first crack in the foundation. I requested a detailed ledger of the fines. The response? Delayed and incomplete, only listed dates and amounts, with no justification beyond generic labels like noncompliance and administrative enforcement.
No photographs.
No inspection reports. No explanation for why some fines repeated monthly even after the alleged issues had been addressed. That was when curiosity replaced frustration. I began reviewing the HOA's governing documents, starting with the declaration, then the rules and regulations, and finally the bylaws. These were not light reading. They were dense, technical, and clearly written to discourage homeowners from digging too deeply. Still, patterns began to emerge. Certain sections were referenced constantly in violation notices, while others seemed to be ignored entirely. The more I read, the clearer it became that the board relied heavily on selective enforcement. Rules were applied broadly in writing but narrowly in practice. Discretion was exercised without documentation. Fines were issued automatically, while appeals were quietly buried. Late one night, while cross-referencing sections mentioned in the violation letters with the actual text of the bylaws, something stood out. A clause buried deep in the enforcement section, formatted differently from the surrounding text, and never mentioned in any communication from the board. It was a limitation clause. The clause outlined strict requirements for how fines could be imposed, including mandatory notice periods, documented evidence, and homeowner hearings before penalties could escalate. More importantly, it stated that failure to follow these procedures invalidated the fines entirely and required reimbursement of any improperly collected amounts, including administrative fees. The realization didn't hit all at once. At first, it felt like a technicality. Then it felt like a possibility. Finally, it felt like a turning point. I reviewed every fine against the clause. None of them met the requirements. Not a single one. Notices were issued without proper timelines. Evidence was never provided. Hearings were never scheduled. The board had skipped every step the bylaws demanded and jumped straight to punishment. The $5,000 balance was not just questionable. According to their own rules, it was illegitimate. What made the situation even more remarkable was that the clause didn't just protect homeowners from improper fines. It imposed penalties on the HOA for noncompliance. If the board failed to follow procedure, the homeowner was entitled to recover costs associated with enforcement actions, including time, legal consultation, and administrative burdens. The power dynamic shifted instantly. What had started as a defensive reaction became an offensive strategy. The board had assumed silence meant compliance. They had assumed confusion meant surrender. They had never considered the possibility that someone would read the entire document they governed by. I began organizing everything. Every letter, every envelope, every date, every discrepancy. The $5,000 number that once felt overwhelming now looked fragile, propped up by negligence and arrogance. The HOA had overplayed its hand. They had counted on fear and fatigue. Instead, they had triggered scrutiny. As the chapter closed, the next step became unavoidable. The clause had to be brought into the light, formally and unmistakably. And once that happened, the board would be forced to confront the consequences of years of unchecked enforcement. The fines were no longer the problem. They were the evidence. Once the missing clause was identified, the story stopped being about fines and started being about accountability. The documents that had once felt intimidating now read like a roadmap. Every skipped step, every vague notice, every unexplained charge had a corresponding requirement the board had ignored. The HOA wasn't just careless. It was systematically bypassing its own rules to fast-track penalties. Preparation became the priority. Emotion had no place in what came next. This wasn't about anger or revenge, even though both were tempting. This was about structure, documentation, and forcing an organization that thrived on intimidation to operate within its own boundaries. I drafted a formal response, carefully structured and meticulously referenced. Each fine was listed chronologically, paired with the specific bylaw requirement that had been violated in its issuance. Notice periods that were too short, evidence that was never provided, hearings that were never offered, escalations that occurred without warning. Every flaw was documented, cross-referenced, and supported by copies of the HOA's own governing documents. The tone was deliberate, calm, professional, unemotional. The letter did not accuse the board of malice or incompetence. It simply stated facts and cited rules. It requested a full dismissal of all fines, immediate removal of the balance from my account, and reimbursement for improperly assessed administrative fees, as required by the Enforcement Limitation Clause. The letter was sent via certified mail, with copies emailed to every board member and the property management company. There would be no claim of ignorance. No quiet dismissal. No pretending it had been lost. The waiting period that followed was tense but revealing. The board, which had once been quick to issue warnings and threats, suddenly went silent. Days passed without acknowledgement. Then weeks. The management company sent a brief response confirming receipt and stating that the matter was under review. That silence was louder than any denial. Behind the scenes, the HOA was scrambling. The clause I had cited wasn't new. It wasn't obscure. It had been part of the bylaws for years, which meant one of two things was true. Either the board didn't know it existed, or they knew and chose to ignore it. Both possibilities were disastrous for them. Eventually, a response arrived. It was longer than previous communications, heavier in legal language, and noticeably cautious. The board did not dispute the existence of the clause. Instead, it attempted to reinterpret it, suggesting that substantial compliance was sufficient and that procedural deviations did not automatically invalidate fines. That argument fell apart under scrutiny. The clause was explicit. It did not allow for partial compliance. It did not grant discretion. It outlined mandatory steps using language like shall and must, leaving no room for interpretation. Failure to follow procedure resulted in nullification of penalties and triggered reimbursement obligations. I replied again, this time attaching highlighted excerpts of the clause, annotated with timestamps showing when each requirement had been skipped. I included a summary table demonstrating that none of the fines met the enforcement criteria. I requested a formal hearing, not to defend myself, but to address the board's failure to comply with its own governing documents. That request changed everything. Hearings were something the board avoided. They created records. They required transparency. They allowed homeowners to speak on the record. For a board that had operated comfortably behind closed doors, this was a risk. The hearing was scheduled in the weeks leading up to it. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Notices began appearing on doors reminding residents of compliance standards. Enforcement slowed noticeably. Long-standing violations in other homes remained untouched. The board was no longer confident. The hearing. The imbalance of power that once defined the relationship was gone. The board members sat behind a table, bound by procedure for once, while the facts spoke louder than any authority they claimed. The ledger of fines was dissected. The lack of evidence was exposed. The absence of hearings prior to enforcement was undeniable. The board attempted to defend its actions as standard practice. That argument only reinforced the problem. Standard practice, it turned out, was systemic noncompliance. The outcome was not immediate. The board recessed to review the findings and consult legal counsel. But the damage was already done. The fines could no longer be enforced. The threat of a lien evaporated. The $5,000 balance was frozen pending resolution. What followed was a quiet but significant shift in posture. The board stopped issuing automated warnings. The management company became more responsive, more careful with language. The tone of every communication softened. Then came the revised statement. The balance was zeroed out. But the story didn't end there. According to the same clause that invalidated the fines, the HOA was obligated to reimburse improperly collected administrative fees and cover costs incurred due to enforcement actions taken in violation of the bylaws. That included late fees, processing charges, and documented expenses related to resolving the dispute. I submitted a reimbursement request. This time, the board did not argue. The amount wasn't massive, but it was symbolic. It represented a reversal of roles. The HOA, which had spent years extracting money through unchecked authority, was now required to pay it back. The check arrived weeks later, quietly, without announcement, without apology. But the impact rippled outward. Other homeowners noticed changes. Enforcement became consistent. Notices included evidence. Hearings were offered before fines escalated. The board became cautious, aware now that the documents they governed by could also govern them. What had begun as a $5,000 threat ended as a lesson in oversight. The missing clause was no longer missing. It had become a precedent. And as the chapter closed, it was clear that the story was no longer just about one homeowner and one HOA. It was about what happens when authority is forced to answer to its own. The reimbursement check cleared quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement, but its impact extended far beyond the amount printed on it. It was proof that the HOA had been wrong, that its authority had limits, and that those limits were written down in the very documents it had used to intimidate homeowners for years. What the board likely expected to be an isolated dispute had become something much more dangerous to their control. A documented example. Change did not happen overnight, but it was unmistakable in the months that followed. The HOA's behavior shifted from aggressive to cautious. Enforcement notices became detailed, including timestamps, photographs, and clearly cited sections of the governing documents. Fines were no longer issued immediately. Warnings were issued first. Hearings were scheduled, not avoided. The board, once comfortable operating in the gray areas of ambiguity, now stayed firmly within the black and white boundaries of procedure. The reason was simple. They knew they were being watched. Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood, even without formal announcements. Homeowners talked, some quietly, some openly. People who had once assumed the HOA was untouchable began comparing notes. Old fine notices were pulled from filing cabinets. Unresolved disputes resurfaced. The missing clause, once buried and ignored, was now common knowledge. The board couldn't stop it. Requests for records increased. Homeowners asked for ledgers, enforcement histories, and hearing documentation. The management company, suddenly aware of its exposure, became meticulous. Every action required justification. Every fine required proof. The casual intimidation that had once defined the HOA's enforcement strategy was gone. What replaced it was something unfamiliar to the board: accountability. The ripple effects extended beyond enforcement. Elections became competitive. Board meetings, once sparsely attended, filled with residents who asked questions and expected answers. Motions were challenged. Minutes were scrutinized. The board, accustomed to operating without resistance, struggled to adapt to transparency. Some members resigned. Their departures were quiet but telling. Positions that once attracted control-minded volunteers now required actual work and public scrutiny. New candidates emerged, running on platforms of fairness, consistency, and adherence to the governing documents. The HOA began to look less like an authority and more like what it was supposed to be all along: a service organization accountable to its members. The clause remained central to every discussion. It was referenced in meetings, cited in emails, and treated with the respect it had always demanded. The board's legal counsel ensured that enforcement procedures aligned perfectly with its requirements. No one wanted a repeat of the situation that had exposed years of negligence. For me, the experience changed how I viewed not just the HOA but power structures in general. The fines had felt personal at first, like a targeted campaign. In reality, they were part of a broader pattern of unchecked authority enabled by silence and assumption. The board hadn't singled me out because I was different. They had targeted me because they could. Until they couldn't. The $5,000 number that once caused stress and uncertainty became a footnote in a much larger story. It was no longer about money. It was about what happens when rules are enforced without understanding, and what happens when someone finally reads the fine print. The most telling moment came months later during an annual meeting. The board presented a revised enforcement policy, outlining procedures in detail and emphasizing homeowner rights. The language mirrored the missing clause almost word for word. What had once been ignored was now highlighted. There was no mention of the past. No acknowledgement of mistakes. But none was necessary. The changes spoke for themselves. The HOA never issued another fine without following procedure. The clause had done its job. Looking back, it was easy to see how the situation had escalated the way it did. The HOA relied on complexity to maintain control. Long documents, legal language, assumptions that no one would read past the first few pages. That strategy worked until it didn't. All it took was one overlooked paragraph. Point 1 clause. Point 1 homeowner willing to challenge the narrative that authority was absolute. The experience didn't turn the neighborhood into a utopia. Disputes still happened. Rules were still enforced. But the balance had shifted. Power was no longer one-sided. It was shared, documented, and constrained by the same words that governed everyone else. The story ended not with confrontation, but with correction. The HOA learned that authority without accountability is fragile. Homeowners learned that knowledge is leverage. And a clause once buried in legal text became the foundation for a more transparent community. The fines were gone. The fear was gone. What remained was a reminder written into the bylaws themselves. Rules apply to everyone, especially those who enforce them.